Device inverted. A carbon arc searchlight was built to guard airfields and ships, until Coastal Command hung it under Wellingtons and Liberators to burn a white tunnel across the Bay of Biscay at night, and U-boat surface doctrine collapsed. The beam came on at 1,000 yards, crews froze behind salt-wet bridge screens, and depth charges dropped in the few heartbeats before the dive klaxon mattered. Subscribe. New Evidence First World War II videos every day. Night sat low and wet over the approaches west of Ushant on the 6th of July, 1942. A wind from the southwest pushed white caps in short ranks, and cloud hung at 800 feet, a Vickers Wellington from number 172. Squadron RAF Coastal Command left Chivanor before midnight, flew a line along the shipping lane that ran northwest of the island of Ouessant, and dropped to 200 feet to hunt. The navigator watched the air-to-surface radar trace and called small course changes, while the wireless operator logged bearings in pencil. The old rule said the ocean at night belonged to the U-boat. German boats surfaced to charge batteries, ventilate, and make speed. In darkness, an aircraft found little but a darker shape on a black sea. Even when radar brought a crew near, the last half-mile went blind because the early metric sets lost the contact inside a short-range shadow. The boat heard engines, ducked under, and the rule stood again. The surprise mechanic broke that rule with light. The same Wellington that rode the radar lobe carried a carbon arc lamp in a faired belly cup, its reflector near 2 feet across. The generator drove the arc bright enough to punch through sea haze. At exactly 1,000 yards, the pilot snapped the switch, turned night into clouded day, and held the beam on the conning tower. A hard metric framed those seconds. At 140 knots over the water, a Wellington covered 1,000 yards in roughly 15 seconds. A U-boat needed near 30 seconds from first alarm to get the bow down and the bridge clear, longer if the sea ran high. RAF crews set depth charges to explode at 25 feet and spaced them for a pattern that walked across the predicted dive line. Against those timings, the window looked narrow but real. The map pin mattered. The Bay of Biscay between the Gironde and Finistère forced German boats to transit on the surface for long reaches. Allied patrol lines inside No. 19 Group's area tightened in early summer of 1942, with outward-bound arcs flown from Chivanor, Saint-Aval, and Thorney Island. The first nights with the light were not experiments in abstraction, but directed sorties over lanes marked on Coastal Command plots with grease pencil and date stamps. A witness object showed the rupture in plain strokes. The unit's after-action report for early July listed a contact time of 23:30 hours, radar bearing steady for 6 minutes, beam on at 1,000 yards, 4 charges released in 2 sticks, and a boil of oil at dawn latitude. The page carried a second mark from the ground, a maintenance card signed off for lamp carbons replaced after 1 sortie, generator brushes inspected, and mounting bolts retorqued. The story ran not on myth, but on entries, signatures, and part numbers. Logistics and training pressed into the method long before the crews saw an enemy. Fitters at Thorney Island aligned reflectors with a chalked line on a hangar wall at dusk, ran the arc for a timed burn, and logged amperage draw against limits. Ground instructors put navigators in a wooden mock-up with a paper radar trace and made them fly blind course lines with a metronome at 1 beat per second. The lamp added weight and drag, so riggers recalculated takeoff run on wet concrete and wrote the new figure in red pencil on the aircraft's form, 700. The sea and sky pushed back. Low cloud at 500 feet clipped patrols and hid spray in the beam, and rain shivered off the perspex and bloomed the light into a white fog if the switch went on too soon. Wind over 20 knots kicked white horses that read at night like small hulls on the radar trace. The constraints did not break the method, but they narrowed the window. Release altitudes dropped to 100 feet, and approach angles flattened to keep the spray under the beam. A common myth said the light worked like magic. The evidence disagreed and set numbers to the work. Radar brought the aircraft within a mile, then the lamp solved the last short range where the set went blind. The myth missed the paired system. The maintenance bench, the radar plot, and the release table formed one chain, and any weak link, wet generator brushes, tired magnetron, wrong depth settings, took the kill away. The angle in the brief was simple. Air-to-surface radar found boats. A powerful searchlight blinded crews seconds before a depth charge or rocket attack. It was applied over Biscay in 1942 by No. 172 Squadron 1st, then by other units under No. 19 Group. The measurement that anchored the angle was the 1,000-yard switch-on, the 15-second run-in, and the 25-foot fuse setting. The witness objects were the AAR page, the radar plot strip cut and pasted in the log, and the depth charge range table. The constraints sat in weather and in generator reliability. The logistics detail showed in the spare carbons carried in a canvas roll and the extra weight in the bomb bay. Cost lived in ledgers, not in crews' mouths, but the program did not break budgets. An Air Ministry production tally in late 1942 placed each lamp well under the cost of one radar set, and the use of existing searchlight carbons and dynamos kept unit price in the hundreds of pounds. Evidence in procurement notes from No. 19 Group showed weekly allotments by tail number and shipset date. The myth that the device was an exotic one-off gave way to the plain count of crates unloaded by a station ferry flight and signed for on a rail manifest. 3 dates framed the break with the old rule. In May of 1942, night circuits at Thorney Island proved the beam would not blind a pilot on flare-out if shielded. In June of 1942, No. 172 Squadron went operational with the light on Biscay transit lanes. In July of 1942, the first confirmed sinkings tied to the method reached the Coastal Command monthly summary and forced BDU to write night surface guidance with new caveats. By dawn, the ocean looked the same to a camera. Oil sheens and bits of deck timber drifted in an unbroken swell west of the Ushant traffic separation. The aircraft log lines showed fuel on landing and arc time logged for the lamp. The contradiction at the end of the first month was quiet. This was not an accident or a lone cruise trick. It was a system, and it had already set distances, timings, and parts lists that other crews could follow. The human liver sat behind a desk and under a lamp much dimmer than the one he sent to sea. Group Captain Humphrey de Verd Lee, attached to Coastal Command on special duties, had worried one problem since 1941. Radar brought aircraft close, but the last few seconds in black water went to the U-boat. He pushed for a high-intensity beam married to radar, not as a searchlight in the abstract, but as a short-range weapon. The title pages say invention, but the file jackets hold a chain of approvals and refusals, and then one unauthorized fit that moved the pieces. The order path ran crooked at first. Air Ministry branches weighed weight, drag, and crew workload and held the line on new kit for tired Wellingtons. Lee brought his idea to Coastal Command trials, and a small team cut a Wellington's belly fairing to house a lamp and a generator. The entry in the station engineering record for late spring of 1942 noted a local mod for experimental lighting, initials only, no fanfare. The aircraft taxied at dusk, ran a bay at low level, and came home with a pilot's note, beam effective, no dazzle if shield set. Senior signatures followed the quiet trial. Air Vice Marshal John Slessor, then holding command at Coastal Command, read the first field notes and wrote a line that kept the file from closing. He authorized limited operational use under No. 19 Group with No. 172 Squadron as lead unit. The group's operations officer wrote an order of battle that paired lamp-equipped Wellingtons with radar sets and assigned them the Biscay lines where U-boats must pass on the surface. The obstacle came in 3 parts and looked dull on paper. First, supply. Magnetos, carbons, reflectors, and generators all drew from strained pools. Second, training. Crews needed a new run-in profile and tighter crew drills for the last 15 seconds that would decide a kill. Third, weather. The light had to be placed and used in true black, not moonwash, and not fog that turned the beam into a wall. The obstacle moved when the group set a training syllabus and gave crews 1 week on circuits, 1 week on water runs, and sign-off on a night release table. A logistics vignette sits in one small card. A maintenance corporal at Thorney Island wrote that the lamp consumed carbons quickly at full arc and that spare rods rode in a canvas roll under the navigator's seat. Each rod weighed a few ounces. The roll added 1.5 pounds. The crew chief added a step to the pre-flight, check carbons, check brushes, check belt tension on the generator, and safety wire the switch guard. Small steps kept the beam from dying during the run-in when spray hit the housing. Names and units anchored the rollout. Number 172 Squadron carried the first operational lamps on Vickers Wellingtons from Chivener and Thorney Island in June. Number 224 Squadron at St. Aval received the next allotment for bays farther south. Liberators under Number 120 Squadron, longer-legged and heavier, joined by autumn and pushed patrol arcs deep into Biscay. The orders bore dates, tail numbers, and positions on the belly where the lamp should sit relative to the bomb bay doors. The decision point arrived when the first month's AAR pages stacked up on the group table. Contacts in darkness turned into attack runs with beam on at 1,000 yards, and patterns dropped with shallow fusing. The ratio of sighted to attacked moved toward parity for the first time at night. The group's intelligence summary for July of 1942 showed confirmed sinkings and probable damages that justified scarce generator shipments and extra training hours. The commander signed a wider fit order for August and September. The cost argument did not stall the program. Procurement notes placed each lamp in the low hundreds of pounds, cheaper than a single radar set by a wide margin. A rail manifest through Exeter listed crates marked lighting assemblies, bound for Chivenor and St. Aval in late June, with quantity in double digits. Ferry pilots signed for them, and station stores recorded receipts with the same calm hand that logged parachute harnesses and tool rolls. The numbers made sense even to boards worried about budgets. Terrain and conditions still held veto power. Cloud bases under 800 feet and rain thick enough to bloom the beam forced crews back on instruments. Biscay squalls moved like walls, and lightning could blow a line or shock a generator. To guard against that, crews added a line to the abort brief. If the beam did not strike clean at 1,000 yards, break off, climb to 500 feet, and reacquire on radar. The constraint never vanished, but it became one more number in a drill. A myth met its evidence in a decoded signal. BDU messages in late July mention increased night air attacks with strong lamps and warned boats to listen for radar sets. That read like a doctrine note, not panic. The evidence in Coastal Command's monthly analysis showed why the lamp mattered. It erased the short-range radar blind and startled bridge crews in the few seconds when they had most to do. The myth that the British had found a single magic device shrank to a practiced method with timed steps and signed orders. By the end of summer 1942, the rollout reached beyond a single squadron. Number 19 Group's mapboards showed new arcs cut across Biscay, and duty pilots carried checklists that put the lamp switch in the same breath as fuse settings and airspeed calls. The human lever had done his work. Lee's early push, Slessor's signature, and the group's training schedule turned an idea into a set of distances, seconds, and parts that any fresh crew could adopt. The decision locked on a date. On the 1st of August, 1942, a group order directed all available Wellingtons under Number 172 Squadron to fly night sectors with lamp and radar paired, with 2 reserve airframes held for maintenance. On the 15th of September, 1942, a follow-on order extended the fit to Liberators in Number 120 Squadron. The pen strokes traveled from Whitehall to hangar floors, and the ocean received the change without a sound. The system worked in 2 linked phases. Find in the dark with radar, then finish in light before the dive. The air-to-surface set scanned a wide swath ahead and on the beam from a few hundred feet above the sea. At ranges inside 2 miles, the trace gave bearing and a creeping range change. Inside the last mile, the old sets lost the contact in a short shadow near the aircraft, which was where the lamp entered. The crew bridged that gap with a timed run-in and a hard switch-on point. Parts sat in simple assemblies. The lamp used a carbon arc inside a polished reflector near 2 feet across, fed by a belt-driven generator tied to the aircraft engine. A shield prevented glare into the cockpit. A servo let the beam slew and hold steady on the target line. The switch lay under a guard to prevent accidental strike. The radar sat on its own mount, with a cathode ray tube for the operator and a small repeater for the navigator. The steps ran in short, rehearsed calls. The radar operator marked the first solid contact and plotted range decrease at 10-second intervals. The navigator computed the run-in, corrected for wind over deck, and gave the pilot a new course every few seconds. At 1,000 yards, the pilot leveled at 100 to 150 feet and armed shallow fuses. The lamp came on, the beam burned a path, and the conning tower jumped out of the gray. The bomb aimer put the sight just ahead of the bow wave and called release for a 4-charge pattern. Reliability and practice sat in the high 8 and 10 when weather cooperated. Lamps failed to strike when carbons wore down, generators tripped when belts slipped, radar sets sometimes dropped contacts in sea clutter. Maintenance cards showed where the faults hid, brushes that glazed at high load, reflectors that pitted with salt, and cracked mounts from hard landings. A crew that checked those items before taxi raised the chance of a clean strike by a wide margin. Witness objects stitched the method to paper. Radar plot strips, glued into the sortie log, showed the creep of a contact from 3 miles to 1 mile, then the blank space where the lamp took over. Depth charge range tables, folded and clipped near the bomb site, listed spacing for different speeds and release heights, with a red circle around 25 feet for night anti-surface. Unit after action report pages carried the times. Beam on at 1,000 yards, release at 800 yards, boil seen at 0 time plus 10 minutes, oil patch coordinates recorded. Maintenance records closed the loop with replaced carbons, tested generators, and alignment checks. 2 constraints pressed hardest: weather set the ceiling and floor, cloud bases under 500 feet, and rain that scattered light cut effectiveness by more than half. Sea state hid small targets on radar. Whitecap clutter at 20 knots of wind turned the trace into a stippled field, unless the operator learned the pattern. Crews trained to read those conditions in the first half hour on station logged them in the Form 700 and adjusted tactics. Lower approach altitudes helped in spray, higher switch-on points helped when haze sat on the water. A logistics and training vignette explains why the last 15 seconds worked. Crews drilled the run-in on a bay with a dummy target boat and a light buoy. The instructor timed calls with a metronome set to 1 beat per second: bearing, speed, height, fusing, beam. Ground crew set up a chalk line in a hangar and aimed the lamp until its hot spot sat 20 yards ahead of the bomb aimer's sight line at 100 feet and 140 knots. The same fitter who signed off the lamp also signed the bomb door hinge inspection. Small integrations kept the whole from shaking apart. A myth met its paper adversary here as well. Stories later called the lamp a blinding surprise that made men helpless. The evidence in U-boat war diaries and coastal command summaries suggests a more limited effect. The beam startled bridge crews. Yes, but the real gain came from finding and fixing the target at the radar-blind range. A decoded signal from late 1942 warned boats to clear the bridge faster at night and to keep engines ready for an emergency dive. The beam took seconds from them. The radar had already taken miles. Numbers framed the method. Switch on at 1,000 yards gave 15 seconds to the drop at 140 knots. Release at 800 yards. Pattern spacing set for the speed of a surfaced boat at 12 to 15 knots. Fuses at 25 feet. Altitude at 100 to 150 feet reduced overshoot and kept the splash inside the cone. If the boat began a crash dive at the instant of the beam, bow angle and water drag still left the conning tower within the lethal bracket for several seconds. The system grew in small refinements before the wider shift to centimetric radar. Crews taped a grease pencil dot on the perspex at the bomb aimer's eyeline to speed the last sight adjustment. A simple hood over the lamp mouth reduced spray blowback and kept the reflector dry for another few seconds. Some Wellingtons carried small rails for rockets later in 1943, but in the first year, the weapon remained the depth charge. The lamp and the radar made sure those charges met the hull before it vanished. Fuel and endurance folded into the method. Wellingtons on Biscay arcs carried enough for 8 to 9 hours with reserves, which left time for 2 or 3 run-ins if the ocean cooperated. Liberators stretched that to 12 hours and pushed farther south. The beam drew extra power, but little fuel cost beyond generator load. The limit came more from crew strain than from tanks. 2 or 3 white-knuckle drops in rain and cloud took attention in chunks. The teas for field tests sat in 3 dates. In June of 1942, the first operational beam-on attacks went into No. 19 Group's log. In early July of 1942, AAR pages recorded the first confirmed sinking tied to the Lampen radar method along a line west of Ushant. In September of 1942, the same pages showed attacks farther south, near the approaches to the Gironde, where outbound boats hugged a schedule that Allied analysts could read from rail and harbor manifests. The method would now face weather edges, choke points, and a doctrinal pivot across a whole wing. By late June of 1942, the first field tests moved from trials airfields to the sea lanes between Ushant and the Gironde. Number 172 Squadron flew from Chivanor and Thorney Island. Number 224 Squadron staged from Saint-Aval for arcs farther south, and a detachment from Number 120 Squadron prepared its liberators for very long legs over the Bay of Biscay. The map pins sat on the edges of real routes: the Ushant traffic lane, the shelf north of the Raz de Seine, and the inbound path to the Gironde estuary. The orders named dates and sectors, and each sortie carried blank after-action pages, fresh radar plot rolls, and depth charge range tables clipped near the bomb site. Training habits followed the aircraft out over water. Crews had run dummy passes in Torbay and off Saunton Sands, measuring the last 15 seconds with metronomes and chalking greased dots on perspex to hold sight lines. Fitters signed maintenance cards for lamp alignment and generator brush checks before each night takeoff. A ferry and rail manifest for late June logged crates of carbon rods and spare reflectors moving from a Midlands depot to Saint-Aval and Chivanor. The witness objects were plain, and they framed the tests as work, not legend. The sea pushed back with weather edges that turned tests into lessons. Cloud bases often hung near 500 to 800 feet, which narrowed approach lanes and pushed pilots lower than comfort. Wind lines at 20 knots salted the radar with white-cap clutter, forcing operators to learn the stipple and the creep that marked a true contact. Rain made the lamp bloom if switched on too soon, which crews learned on the second or third night and marked in pencil on Form 700. The constraint never vanished. It sat beside the method from the first test to the last. The myth that the beam alone decided every attack met paper from both sides. A decoded BDU signal in early July warned boats of strong lamps and urged faster bridge clearance at night, but it also noted that radar must be the finder. Coastal Command summaries the same week showed that attacks without a clean radar run-in often failed, even with good light. The beam was a last-range tool. The evidence did not bend. Case 1. Defense holds. On the night of the 7th of July, 1942, a Wellington from No. 172 Squadron hunted west of Ushant, where the deep channel bends around a sandbank marked by buoys. The crew rode a steady air-to-surface trace for 6 minutes, dropped to 150 feet, and lit the beam at 1,000 yards. A sudden squall thickened spray and turned the beam into a white wall, and the pilot lost the tower line for 3 seconds. The after-action report recorded no release, a break-off to 500 feet, and a return 2 hours later with fuel to spare. The radar plot strip glued into the log shows a clean creep, then a flat line when the weather erased the last half mile. The next morning's aerial reconnaissance photo over the same square showed no oil or debris, only wind lanes and a tide seam. The crew chief wrote a maintenance note to fit a deeper hood over the lamp mouth to cut spray blowback. A range table margin now carried a pencil note to delay switch on by 2 seconds when rain squalls sat under cloud. The defense held that night not because the method was wrong, but because weather moved faster than the last calls could adjust. Case 2, Choke Point and Weather Edge. On the 24th of July, 1942, No. 224 Squadron ran a Wellington south of the Gironde mouth, where outbound boats climbed the shallow shelf before turning for deep water and the La Palisse roadstead off La Rochelle. Broken fog lay in torn bands at 200 to 300 feet. The radar held a contact through the gaps. The beam went on at 1,000 yards and caught a conning tower crossing a swell seam. 4 charges went in 2 pairs with fuses at 25 feet. A ship's log line from a nearby French trawler noted an oil slick and cork floats rising inside 30 minutes and marked the spot against the rivermouth bearing. Aerial reconnaissance out of Plymouth at first light traced an oil tongue near 5 miles long, curling toward the sandbars east of Cordouan Lighthouse. The unit summary logged a probable sinking with coordinates and a second pass that dropped markers for later collection. A decoded signal 2 days later mentioned an outbound boat overdue on the Lorient Rail to Port schedule, which intelligence penciled to the same case. The choke point gave the crew a fixed seam. The beam gave them the last clear sight. Case 3. Doctrine pivot at wing level. On the 9th of September, 1942, Number 19 Group paired a long-leg Liberator from Number 120 Squadron with 2 Wellingtons from Number 172 Squadron over a southern Biscay arc west of Cape Finisterre. A high-frequency direction-finding fix from shore stations near Brixham and Malin Head gave a first vector. The Liberator took the long leg and passed bearings by wireless to the Wellingtons. The first aircraft lit the beam at 1,000 yards and forced a crash dive. The second arrived within 20 minutes and found the same boat at periscope depth by the oil boil, timing a delayed pattern with fuses now set to 35 feet. The group analysis recorded a measurable effect. Time from first HF/DF fix to first beam-on dropped from roughly 45 minutes to near 20. The wing's monthly AAR pages stapled together a new pattern, layered sensors, staggered arrivals, and repeat attacks over one plotted square until oil and debris answered the log lines. A production tally at the Air Ministry in late September showed fresh lamp sets issued to cover the expansion. Maintenance cards from Thorney Island logged a slight rise in generator faults after long overwater legs, which the engineering officer tied to belt tension and salt creep. A simple inspection step trimmed the failures the next month. The pivot was not a speech, it was a page count. By the end of September, the case studies had become the doctrine in action. 3 dates, 7th of July, 24th of July, 9th of September, marked failures and successes that printed into checklists. 3 formations, Number 172 Squadron, Number 224 Squadron, Number 120 Squadron carried the weight. 3 places, Ushant, the Gironde mouth, the square west of Cape Finisterre, fixed the learning to map pins with river, shelf, and cape as cues. The measurable effect sat in lines, 15 seconds from light to drop, 25 or 35 feet on fuses, and contact to beam times falling by tens of minutes when HF/DF joined radar and light. Logistics scaled with the trials. Rail manifests into St. Aval in August listed 24 crates of lamp assemblies and carbon rods. Ferry flights carried more to Chivanor and to Aldergrove for northern arcs toward the North Channel. Production tallies in Whitehall reached into 3 figures by early autumn and kept unit costs in the low hundreds of pounds by using common carbons and existing dynamos. The witness objects, after-action pages, radar plots, aerial photos, decoded signal summaries, held the claims steady. Each line had a date, a mile count, or a fuse setting. By early October of 1942, weather at Biscay edges turned colder and more variable. The constraint stayed real. Fog bands, sudden rain, and sea states that hid small wakes on radar even at close range. Crews adjusted switch-on points, accepted more break-offs, and wrote those decisions into the same simple language on the forms. The tests had ended in practice. Now the enemy would answer with its own moves. The next act would chart that countermove, the limits it found, and the refinements Coastal Command wrote into the method with dates, parts, and quiet costs. The opponent's first countermove came as a box no larger than a book. In late summer of 1942, German boats began to carry passive receivers that crews called METOCs. The set sniffed the long metric emissions from air-to-surface radar and gave a warning tone before the aircraft drew near. BDU signals through August and September advised more time on the surface under overcast, then quick dives when the tone rose. The device promised minutes, and minutes mattered when 15 seconds at the end decided life. The effect showed on paper before it showed in wreckage. Number 19. Group's intelligence summary for the second half of September plotted more lost contacts inside 2 miles, with crews reporting empty water when the lamp went on. Radar plot strips glued into sortie logs show creeps that flatten a half-mile sooner than before. The myth that the beam had lost value missed the pairing. The radar warning told the boat when to vanish, but it did not help in the final flash if the aircraft arrived unheralded. The evidence would soon change again when a new radar set spoke in shorter waves. Hard limits inside Coastal Command stood apart from the enemy's devices. The lamp drew current and heat, generator belts wore fast under spray, carbons pitted if the arc struck dirty. Maintenance cards from Thorney Island and St. Aval in October tallied a rise in lamp misfires during long, wet patrols. A training circular that month added a step: run a brief arc strike on the dispersal line to burn off damp before taxi. A small logistics note marked more spare brushes sent by rail to St. Aval, with quantities in the low hundreds to cover the month. Weather remained the universal veto. Cloud at 300 feet forced approaches that grazed the sea. Rain turned the beam to fog if switched on early. Gale lines at 25 knots hid wakes and hammered pilots into fatigue at the end of the leg. Unit AAR pages in November record more aborts and more second passes with fuel tightening toward the reserve line. The range tables stayed the same, 25 feet and 35 feet fuse settings, but the decision to drop slid later in the last seconds to avoid scattering patterns in heavy swell. The constraint sat in every paragraph, and it paid no attention to invention. BDU tried a second countermove in the spring of 1943 that looked bold on paper and bled in practice. Selected boats sailed as flak traps, with added anti-aircraft guns and orders to remain on the surface to fight off aircraft. The idea promised that a stable gun platform and concentrated fire would break single aircraft before they closed to lamp ranges. Coastal Command answered with a refinement rather than a retreat. Groups began to pair aircraft by default, taught stern approaches that kept gunners masked, and introduced rockets on some Wellingtons and Liberators by mid-year. The lamp still came on at 1,000 yards. The difference now was the extra weight of metal in the air. A dated refinement broke the METOX edge. In late winter and early spring of 1943, centimetric radar sets reached frontline aircraft under Coastal Command. The shorter wavelength fell outside METOX's ears. A group circular in March told crews to expect firm contacts inside the old blind, with the lamp now a certainty rather than a guess in the last quarter mile. The first month with the new sets shows in radar plots that hold the contact to the very end, and in AAR lines that record beam on and release with fewer blanks. Fuse settings and drop patterns also flexed against the enemy's faster crash dives. A training note in November of 1942 had already added 35 feet as an option when boats started down at the first glare. In April of 1943, some crews carried one stick set at 50 feet to catch a hull that reached deeper water in the few seconds between beam and drop. Range tables revised that spring give spacing for various speeds and add a caution about overshoot if the pilot let the nose climb at the flash. The changes were small, but the small things counted. A logistics vignette framed the strain. Production tallies in Whitehall list more than 100 lamp assemblies issued by December of 1942 and beyond 200 by March of 1943. Rail manifests show weekly shipments of carbons and reflectors to St. Aval, Chivanor, and Aldergrove. Maintenance cards spike with replacements after salt storms, and station workshops fabricate simple hoods to keep spray out of the mouths. The program did not break for lack of parts, but it needed attention measured in boxes, belts, and man-hours. The quiet cost sat in the air, not just on the bench. Coastal Command lost aircraft to weather, to flak, and to simple fatigue errors on black water. A Wellington from No. 224 Squadron ditched in heavy rain in December of 1942 after a lamp short took the pilot's night vision at the wrong second. The crew survived by dinghy and wrote the failure chain in neat lines that the engineering section read and fixed with extra shielding. The lamp solved a problem, but it also added a switch, a glare risk, and a power draw. Crews carried that weight in their hands in the last seconds. The opponent's devices evolved again near the end of 1943. Newer receivers, later called Naxos, began to hear the shorter centimetric emissions. BDU signaled caution and pushed boats toward deeper submerged runs in Biscay and toward night surface work farther from the air cover arcs. The countermove helped a little at the edges, but it ran into geography and arithmetic. A boat submerged at 4 knots took days longer to cross the shelf and reach convoys. The lamp and its radar partner had already forced that choice. A myth claimed that flares and moonlight could have done the same job and that the lamp was an expensive flourish. The evidence said otherwise. Aerial reconnaissance photos and ship's log lines show night attacks at dates and places where flares would have burned out of the cone or drifted downwind. The lamp put light in a tight tunnel for the few seconds needed at 1,000 yards and 800 yards. It did not ask the wind for permission. The cost per set stayed in the hundreds of pounds. The cost per convoy saved sat in columns that never needed adjectives. By the close of 1943, the refinements had settled into a routine. Crews drilled the same 15 seconds on chalked floors and dark bays. The lamp switch lived under a guard and a thumb. Radar plot strips pasted into logs ran smooth to the end. HF/DF fixes from shore posts near Brixham, Malin Head, and the Lizard entered the chain as starting points, and liberators from No. 120 Squadron stretched legs that Wellingtons could not. Limits remained, counter-moves came and went, but the method kept its spine. Find, light, and drop within a narrow window that training could protect. Immediate outcomes printed in monthly summaries with dates. In October and November of 1942, Coastal Command logged a rise in night attacks in Biscay sectors, with lamp use noted on after-action pages. In December of 1942, the first month with centimetric sets in limited service, pushed confirmed sinkings upward despite winter weather. In March of 1943, group analysts tied a drop in outbound transit speed for boats on the Gironde and La Pallice routes to increase night air pressure, light included. The records crossed desks in Whitehall and Lorient, and each side read the other's dates through different filters. Operational effects followed the numbers. A boat that once crossed the shelf at 15 to 17 knots on the surface now spent long reaches at 4 knots submerged. Rail and harbor manifests from Lorient and Saint-Nazaire show delays piling day upon day as boats waited for darker weather windows and then crawled out under the shelf. Convoy loss rates on the western approaches bent down through winter and early spring. In May of 1943, later called Black May, U-boat losses surged to 41 boats in 1 month as air coverage thickened across the gap and surface transits became traps. The lamp did not act alone, but it helped hold the last seconds tight when the radar and the vector lined the pieces up. 3 places show the change on maps with river and road cues. Off Ushant, where the traffic lane bends, after-action pages from No. 172 Squadron logged short runs that ended in oil boils marked against the island light and the N165 road line on Brittany's coast. Off the Gironde mouth, aerial photos in late spring of 1943 show stretches of oil and foam curling toward the river bar east of Cordouan Lighthouse, with the Bordeaux rail timetable later marking outbound gaps. Off La Pallice and the Charente estuary near La Rochelle, liberators from No. 120 Squadron put long legs over the shelf and registered contacts in sectors drawn with cape bearings and sandbank edges. The geography shaped the arithmetic, and the method pressed into that shape. Witness objects record the step-down in pressure on convoys. Unit AAR pages in June of 1943 count fewer night torpedo tracks near the western approach's convoy lanes. Ships' loglines from escorts in mid-Atlantic note shorter periods of high alert at night and more hours with no contact. Then tie that to shore HF/DF reports of boats held in Biscay during certain weather runs. Production tallies list lamp issues still climbing through the first half of 1943, and maintenance cards record routine replacements rather than emergency fixes as workshops caught up. The paper heap looks dull until a finger runs across dates and sees the curve change. Costs and quiet aftermath appear in different entries. Coastal Command lost crews to weather and to flak even as the method matured. Aircraft names and serials run in neat lines across station boards. The lamp's unit price stayed in the hundreds of pounds per set. Generator belts and carbon rods added pennies to each sortie. Time stayed the highest cost. Crews flew 8 or 9 hours in Wellingtons and up to 12 hours in Liberators, with 2 or 3 high-stress drops in rain and spray. The numbers sat in logbooks and in men's faces at dawn. After the spring of 1943, the enemy's options narrowed. BDU signals urged more submerged transits in Biscay and more night surface work only at long ranges from air arcs, which forced fuel and battery arithmetic that hurt patrol time near convoys. Naxos receivers in late 1943 clawed back some warning against centimetric sets, But by then, the arcs had widened and escort carriers added new decks and planes to the mid-ocean. The lamp still mattered in the last seconds. It had moved from breakthrough to routine. Legacy sits in method, not in hardware alone. Post-war maritime patrol aircraft did not carry carbon arcs under the belly in the same way, but they kept the chain, find with sensors, fix with a confirmation tool, finish in a timed window. Sonobuoys, magnetic anomaly detectors, and later infrared search and laser markers replaced parts of the old system. Yet the simple logic from Lee's desk remained on checklists in new ink. Pair sensors to erase blind ranges, teach the crew the last seconds with drills, and write distances and fuse settings that survive stress. The lamp's white tunnel became other beams and other cues. Dates mark the long tail. On the 6th of June, 1944, Allied landings drew boats toward the channel under new air cover bands where the lamp and radar combination still found surface targets on dark nights. In September of 1944, the U-boat bases along the French Atlantic coast came under direct ground pressure, and rail manifests that once fed La Rochelle and Lorient thinned out. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. Coastal Command's monthly summaries closed their thick books with final tallies and last sorties. The chain that began with a trial lamp under a Wellington had run straight through to silence on the same sea. The myth that victory came from one machine fell away in the way the lamp entered doctrine. Production tallies in Whitehall did not claim miracles. They counted sets, carbons, and belts. After-action pages did not write poetry. They wrote beam on at 1,000 yards, release at 800 yards, fuses at 25 or 35 feet, and oil seen. Radar plots did not argue. They traced lines in ink. The legacy is this paper, the habit of turning dark water into measured distances in timed acts. Return to the first map pin, and the old rule that night belonged to the boat. The bend-off Ushant still takes the tide in short rips when wind runs from the southwest. The sea looks empty at dawn, and even the oil of old fights has long washed away. The island's light keeps its slow sweep over the channel, and the road on Brittany's coast carries trucks toward St. Evol's turnoff. The reason the rule broke once fits again in a small space: a radar trace, a thumb on a guarded switch, and a white tunnel across black water for 15 seconds that made time run another way.